My sister called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds that she was trying not to cry. I just need somewhere to go for a few days, she said. Just until I can figure out next steps. Her name is Daphne. She's 29, 2 years younger than me, and she'd spent the last 4 years building a life with a man who turned out to be something she hadn't signed up for. She didn't say I'm leaving him on that phone call. She didn't have to. I heard it in the way she exhaled, that long, careful breath of someone who has finally made a decision they've been afraid to make for a very long time. Come, I told her. Come right now. I'll make up the guest room. I hung up and walked into the kitchen where my husband was sitting at the counter with his laptop, and I told him my sister was going through a hard time and would be staying with us for a few days. He looked up from his screen. How many days? I don't know. A few. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was filing something away to be annoyed about later, and went back to typing. I told myself it was nothing. He was just in the middle of something. He was just in the middle of something. He was just processing. People need a moment. Daphne arrived that evening with one bag and red eyes and the particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. I made her tea. We sat at the kitchen table and talked until midnight quietly, the way sisters do. My husband came downstairs once for water, said hello without making eye contact, and went back up. I noticed. I didn't say anything. The next morning I made breakfast for all three of us. My husband came downstairs, looked at the extra plate on the table and said he wasn't hungry, then took his coffee into the home office and closed the door. I watched Daphne watch him walk away. She gave me a small, careful smile, the kind that means I'm sorry for being here. That made something tighten in my chest. She wasn't in the way. She did her dishes. She kept her voice low on phone calls. She folded the blanket on the couch every morning even though she was sleeping in the guest room. She was, by every possible measure, the easiest houseguest a person could have. But my husband moved through the apartment like someone enduring a great inconvenience, sighing at nothing, going quiet at dinner, answering her questions in 3 words or fewer. On the 3rd day, Daphne pulled me aside while he was in the shower and said, I think I should find somewhere else to stay. You don't have to do that. He's uncomfortable. That's not your problem to fix. She looked at me for a moment. Is it yours? I didn't answer that. I should have. She stayed one more night and then moved into a friend's apartment across town. I hugged her at the door and told her to call me every day, and I meant it, and I did call her every day. But something had settled into the apartment after she left. A quiet that felt less like peace and more like a verdict. My husband was warmer that night, poured me a glass of wine, asked about my day, sat close to me on the couch. I remember thinking, this is who he is when it's just us. And instead of that making me feel better, it made me feel something I didn't want to name yet. 3 months passed. They passed the way time does when you're slightly uncomfortable in your own life, quickly and also somehow very slowly. Daphne was doing better. She'd found a new apartment, started therapy, texted me memes about being unbothered. I was glad for her. I was also still thinking about that morning at the breakfast table, about my husband's untouched coffee, about the door to the home office closing. Then one evening in November, my husband got off a call with his brother and came into the living room with an expression I recognized as the one he uses when he wants something he expects me to say no to. So, he said, my brother. His brother. I'll call him what he is. My brother-in-law had just been laid off. Startup folded, the whole thing. He'd been living in a city 4 hours away, but his lease was up at the end of the month, and he'd asked my husband if he could stay with us while he figured out his next move. How long? I asked. My husband shrugged. A few weeks, maybe a month, just until he gets something lined up. I sat with that for a moment. A few weeks, maybe a month. My sister, who was going through the most painful thing she'd ever been through, had been made to feel like a burden after 4 days. 4 days. And now my brother-in-law, who was between jobs and between cities, was going to move in for potentially a month, and my husband was standing in front of me like this was a completely normal thing to ask. Okay, I said. I don't know why I said okay. I think I wanted to see what would happen. I think some part of me already knew and needed to watch it confirm itself. My brother-in-law arrived on a Friday with 3 bags, a guitar, and enough charisma to fill the room he walked into. His name is Scott. He's 34, funny in that slightly exhausting way, and he has the particular gift of making himself at home in about 11 minutes. By Friday evening, he was sprawled on our couch watching football with my husband, laughing at things on their phones, ordering pizza because we should celebrate, come on. I set out plates. I got napkins. I cleared away the boxes afterward because neither of them moved. I told myself it was the first night, people settle in. But the settling didn't really happen, at least not in the way I mean. Scott settled in magnificently. My husband settled into a version of himself I hadn't seen in a long time, loose, laughing, present in the way he almost never was when it was just us. What didn't settle was any kind of equilibrium. What didn't settle was anything resembling fairness. The first week I cooked 4 times. Not because anyone asked me to, because I was used to being the person who made dinner and no one offered to help, and I didn't want to be the one who made it weird. Scott complimented the food lavishly and enthusiastically and then left his plate on the table each time. My husband did too. I did the dishes. The second week, Scott started using my home office to do some job searching, which I understood conceptually, and which in practice meant that when I needed to work from home on Thursday, I had to sit up at the kitchen counter because he'd been in there since 8 in the morning playing something on his laptop that had sound effects. I mentioned it gently to my husband that evening. I just need a heads up if he's going to be in there, so I can plan. My husband's face shifted in a way I recognized. He's going through a hard time. Just give him some space. Give him some space. In my office, in my apartment. I thought about Daphne. I thought about the way my husband had walked past her plate at breakfast, like it wasn't there. I didn't say anything. I went back to the kitchen counter. Week 3. Scott had settled into a rhythm that seemed designed by someone who had never had to think about the rhythm of anyone else. He woke up at 10. He ate cereal and left the bowl in the sink. He spent afternoons on the couch. He made elaborate late-night snacks and left the kitchen in a state that I would find in the morning. He was perfectly pleasant about all of it. He'd say sorry if I pointed something out, genuinely sorry, the kind of sorry that has no structural memory, and then do the same thing 2 days later. My husband thought this was largely fine. Actually, he didn't just think it was fine. He thought my noticing it was the problem. "You're being tense," he said one morning after I'd mentioned, for the second time, that the dishes in the sink were getting out of hand. "I'm being tense. He's my brother. He's going through something. My sister was going through something, it just came out. I hadn't planned to say it. But once it was out, it was completely, totally, irretrievably out, and we were both looking at it." My husband's expression did a complicated thing. "That's different." "How?" Not a question. I genuinely wanted to hear his answer. "Your sister is... She could have gone somewhere else. She had options. She came to us because she needed family. And Scott needed family. Scott has been here 3 weeks. Daphne was here 4 days, and you went into the home office and closed the door. He said I was being unfair. He said I was making it a competition when it wasn't. He said he just wanted his brother to feel welcome in our home, and why was that so hard for me to support? And here is the part I'm not proud of." I backed down. I said, "Okay, you're right, I'm sorry." And I made dinner that night, and I cleared the plates, and I went to bed and lay there in the dark feeling like I had swallowed something that was not going to stay swallowed. I called Daphne the next morning. I didn't tell her everything. I told her enough. She listened, and then she said quietly, "You know what you felt when you watched him walk past my plate that morning? That's what I've been watching you do to yourself for 2 years." I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. Things shifted in me after that. Not dramatically. I'm not someone who operates dramatically. But something recalibrated. I started watching differently. I started noticing the things I'd been explaining away. I noticed that I had not had a single evening of quiet in 3 weeks. I noticed that my husband and his brother made plans. Restaurants, a weekend trip to see friends, and I was informed rather than included. I noticed that when Scott finally did get a job offer, week 4, a full week longer than a few weeks, my husband celebrated with a bottle of whiskey they drank together while I cleaned up after the dinner I'd made to mark the occasion. I noticed that I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Scott was leaving on a Saturday. He had a new city, a new job, a furnished sublet. He packed his 3 bags and his guitar and shook my hand and said, "You're a saint. Seriously, thank you for having me." And I smiled and said it was no problem, and then the door closed behind him and it was just the 2 of us. My husband put his arm around me. "That was really good of you," he said. "I know it wasn't always easy." I looked at him. "I need to ask you something." He waited. "Why was it so easy for you to make my sister feel unwelcome after 4 days? And so easy to let your brother stay for a month without asking me once if I was okay?" He started with, "That's not what happened." And I'm not going to transcribe that whole conversation because it was long and it went in circles and it ended with him telling me that I was holding on to things and that I had to let things go. I let a lot of things go after that, just not the ones he meant. I called Daphne. I told her I was coming to stay with her for a few days. She said come right now, she'd make up the couch. I said I'd bring wine. She said she'd make pasta. I packed a bag. Not everything, just what I needed for a few days. And then I sat down on the edge of the bed and I thought about what I would say when my husband came home and found the note I'd left on the counter. The note said, "I need a few days. I know you'll want to talk. I'll call you when I'm ready. Please think while I'm gone about what going through something looks like and who in this house you've decided deserves patience." He called 3 times before I'd made it to the highway. I didn't pick up. I had the windows down. It was a cold night, the kind of cold where the air is sharp enough to feel like it's clearing something out. I drove the 30 minutes to Daphne's with the radio off, and just the sound of the road, and somewhere around the 20-minute mark I noticed that my shoulders had dropped about 2 inches. I hadn't realized they'd been up. Daphne opened her door in sweatpants and a huge sweater with pasta sauce in the sleeve. And when she saw my face, she just stepped aside without saying anything, and I walked in and sat down on her kitchen floor. Literally on the floor. Which is not something I can explain except that it was exactly the right height for how I felt. And she sat down next to me and we stayed there while the pasta finished cooking. "What are you going to do?" she said eventually. "I don't know yet." "That's okay." It was okay. Not knowing yet was okay. I was allowed to sit on my sister's kitchen floor and not know yet, and the world would wait for me. Here is what I do know now, from enough distance to see it clearly. I spent 2 years making myself smaller in that apartment. Not because he asked me to. He never asked me directly. But because the environment made smallness feel like the safer choice. Because when I wasn't small, there was friction. Because it was easier to absorb things than to name them. Because I told myself he was just under pressure. Just having a hard week. Just needed time. Just is a very small word for a very large amount of excusing. I know that I am someone who drives to her sister's apartment in the cold with the windows down and sits on the kitchen floor and doesn't know what comes next, and that this is not weakness. I used to think not knowing was the same as being lost. I think now it might just be the beginning of finding your way somewhere true. My husband and I have talked since then. Plural talks, long ones, some of them hard in ways I wasn't prepared for. I'm not going to tell you where we are right now because honestly, I'm still figuring that out, and I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy ending. What I will tell you is this. The night I drove to Daphne's, she and I ate pasta on her kitchen floor and split a bottle of wine and talked until 2 in the morning, and at some point she said, "I forgot you were like this." Like what? Like yourself. I thought about that for a long time afterward, about how quietly a person can drift from themselves. About how it doesn't happen in one big moment. It happens in 100 small ones. 100 small choices to absorb rather than address, to explain rather than name, to let go rather than hold. About how driving away with the windows down can feel like the first full breath you've taken in longer than you realize. I'm still figuring out what comes next. But I know what I felt, sitting on that kitchen floor. I felt like myself again, and that was worth following. I used to think patience was the same thing as strength. I think that's where a lot of women lose themselves. And the idea that holding on, absorbing, staying quiet is somehow the noble choice. I did that for 2 years. I smoothed things over and made excuses and told myself he was just stressed. Just adjusting. Just having a hard week. Just. That word did a lot of heavy lifting in my marriage, and I let it. What I understand now is that how someone treats the people you love tells you something more honest than almost anything else about them. My husband never said a cruel word to Daphne directly, He didn't have to. He walked past her plate. He closed the door. He was perfectly civil in a way that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that she was not welcome. And then he wondered why I remembered it. What you do when no one is making you do anything. That's who you are. He didn't have to treat Scott like family. He chose to. He didn't have to treat Daphne like an inconvenience. He chose that too. Those choices exist side by side, and they don't cancel each other out. I spent too long trying to make them cancel each other out. There's a kind of clarity that only comes from stepping back far enough to see the whole picture. I couldn't see it from inside the apartment, inside the routine, inside the pattern of absorbing and explaining. I could only see it when I was driving with the windows down and my shoulders finally dropped. I think that's true for a lot of things in life. You can't evaluate the shape of something when you're standing inside it. Daphne told me I seemed like myself again. That sentence has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole period. Because the terrifying thing isn't losing yourself dramatically. It's losing yourself so gradually that you stop noticing the distance. You don't feel yourself getting smaller. You just slowly stop taking up the space you used to occupy. And one day you're sitting on your sister's kitchen floor and the feeling of being there. Just being somewhere that feels safe, makes you realize how long you'd been somewhere that didn't. What I want anyone to take from this, if you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of the story, is that naming a thing is not the same as destroying it. I was afraid that if I named what was happening, I'd have to blow up my life. But naming it just means you stop lying to yourself. What you do after that is still yours to decide. Strength isn't silence. Strength is seeing clearly and then choosing honestly. Daphne chose to leave a relationship that wasn't safe. I chose to drive to her apartment and sit on her floor and say, "I don't know what comes next," out loud, which was the most honest thing I'd said in a long time. Neither of those choices was easy. Both of them were right. You don't have to have the whole answer to take one true step.